Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Markoff. I'm a friend of the Computer History Museum. I'm here with Lee Felsenstein, who is the author of the book we're going to talk about today, Me and My Big Ideas, subtitled Counterculture, Social Media, and the Future. And do we have a pub date? When was it?
October 15th.
Okay, it's about to be published and available on Amazon and iTunes and
Yes.
paper and ebook?
Paper and ebook on Amazon.
Okay. Is there going to be an audio version? Not
It's
yet.
not planned yet.
Okay, not planned. But and this, Lee pointed out to me, this is where would you put this on the scale? This is not an autobiography.
Yes, it's sort of a memoir, but a fairly long one. I call it a biography of certain ideas. Ideas about social media and society.
So let's start. Remind me how you ended up studying electrical engineering at UC Berkeley in the early 1960s or 1960s. Did you arrive in 63 or 64?
63. Well, it goes way back. My maternal grandfather was an engineer, mechanical engineer, and he was fairly clearly autistic, according to the family lore, but high enough functioning that he invented around 1915 to 1920 some improvements in the diesel engine, which made it possible to use in automobiles and even airplanes. I won't go into details here, but he set the family up with a nice little fortune in 1920 and died of a staph infection and medical malpractice that year. So my mother, who was 5 at the time he died, always told me that your grandfather was an inventor and he had patents, which is of course where the money came from. And I didn't know what a patent was, but I knew that that was something very important to my mother if I was going to get in her good and stay in her good graces. I have an older, smarter brother who was 3 years older than me, and apparently he was given the job of teaching me everything he knew, which didn't always work. And he got into biology and mathematics. Now, so that I couldn't get into those. And there was a chemistry book around the house, a high school chemistry book. And I got interested in that when I was about 10 or so. And then I read in the book that in order to be a chemist, you had to know a lot of mathematics. That was it for that. So they said, okay, what else am I interested in? Well, there's electricity. And my brother had, in the hand-me-down chain, been given a little crystal radio kit, which is like 3 components. And if you hooked up a long wire for an antenna, you would hear stuff. And he didn't know what to do with that and didn't care, so he gave it to me. That was my introduction.
So it was a kit that was completed, or you actually...
No, but not very hard to complete.
Yeah.
I built it up, and then I managed to string a fairly long wire antenna on the back of our house in Philadelphia. It's a row house, everything crammed together. But I got an antenna, and then I could listen to the new rock and roll music in 1955 or 56.
So this was before Wolfman Jack.
Right, I never heard of him. He was a Southern California phenomenon. But we had Georgie Wood's original rock and roll show. We had a black radio station going right across the river from us. And I guess Crystal Radio gets the strongest station. So I would listen in bed to them introducing this fine young man, Elvis Presley. So that I got interested in radio and electronics.
But to Berkeley, that seems like such a stretch from a kid who grows up in Philadelphia.
My parents were left-wing radicals. They had been, by the time I was 8, they had been kicked out of the Communist Party. for doing organizing that wasn't their idea, the party's idea. And they did not indoctrinate me in any way, but they exposed me to a lot of books. When I was 16, they gave me a copy of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which is really an introduction to psychedelics in a way. And I wasn't sure why they did that, but okay. And at that time, there were a number of other books coming up. I mentioned them in the book here. You know, A Nation of Sheep, about the forthcoming war in Southeast Asia, and The Hidden Persuaders about advertising. Vance Packard. And then finally, Catch-22.
Early, okay.
So I had an exposure to a lot of the sort of literary and political thinking about, you know, things are not quite as they are being represented in the papers. And I hung out with a group of kids whose parents all knew my parents, sort of red diaper babies. And we did things like go on a bus trip down to Washington, D.C. to march with Martin Luther King and others in 1958 and 59, Youth March for Integration. And you wouldn't have heard of it because it was blacked out in the press entirely. But we were doing that. We were protesting, you know, in our ineffective ways. So I started reading a book called The True Bohemia, which was about San Francisco and the beat scene. And that got very interesting. My brother had gone to Wisconsin, and I remember talking with my mother about my plans. I said, well, I'm going to go to the University of Wisconsin. I'm going to live in the same place he lived. And she said, that's one thing you're not going to do. So I had to pick my own place. And that became Berkeley because I got this feeling that there was a lot going there and could go on there and had gone on there. And also, I had been accepted by Purdue and in the fields of Indiana, and Carnegie Tech at the time in Pittsburgh. But I blew the application process for scholarship. I was a National Merit finalist, but I didn't want to bother my parents with that. Their marriage was breaking up. So I didn't get a scholarship. So I had to look for a public university, Berkeley fit, and they accepted me.
Yeah. So the next stop is you arrived at the perfect time. I mean, this is sort of like Stuart Brand. You were a person who was early to sense things, you're pressing it a little bit. But anyway, you get there, the free speech movement is happening.
Not quite. I get there in September of '63.
Okay.
So I have a year before this free speech movement happens.
Okay. And you start studying electrical engineering?
That's right.
Was it computing at this point, or was it pre-computing?
Technically, it was EECS, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. But the only computer science I ever had was one course in Fortran programming. So
it was circuit design and things like that?
Yeah, it was analog for them, pretty much.
Okay. And then you participate in the free speech movement. What's the path? I'm interested in the connection between the free speech movement and the technology things that you got into. Was it because of your role in the movement? Did you sort of gravitate toward technical support or technical?
Well, I basically defined my role as technical support because that's all I really knew how to do. I was in awe of all those other extremely intelligent and experienced people. I mean, some as old as 24, and you know, graduate students and so forth. I couldn't match them intellectually, and so what I could do is put two wires together. So I said, okay, I'll help as best I can. I happened to be on a work-study work period where I was unexpectedly back on campus, so I had no classes. That's the place to be if you're going to be in a revolution.
So, but the interesting thing is you took away some ideas from this that in retrospect, are slightly surprising to me. I mean, the importance of communications and the connection between technology and social movements grew out of your early involvement in the free speech movement.
Exactly, and that's a large part of what this book is about. What I experienced was, first of all, a kind of terror of we're all going to get expelled. And then we go through that and the sit-in and so forth and arrests, and then we win. The faculty votes in our favor. And so the rules get basically minimized. Everybody on campus, in January of 1965, it was a magical scene. People were doing whatever they wanted to do in terms of politics and starting magazines. There was a little magazine called Spider, and it's a precursor of Rolling Stone. And it happened that Jan Wenner, the future publisher of Rolling Stone, was right there on campus. So it was a magical kind of experience for me. All of a sudden, first of all, the terror and the rules were gone, and you could do anything you felt you wanted to do. I signed up for a political science course, and I started writing some stuff. Now, I wanted life to be like that all the time. And so the question for me was, okay, what technological tools would this require to sustain it? And from my experience, I saw the student body, which wasn't a body, it was just a bunch of isolated students, form a community. And it's still a kind of a magical process that I can't describe, but it was analyzed for me afterwards, not long afterwards, that the barriers to communication between people went down during the struggle. You could talk to a stranger about it, and it was legitimate. And it unleashed a great deal of energy in terms of volunteers and so forth. So the question became, what technological work would facilitate this process to make it a permanent kind of thing?
Yeah.
That's what I've been following.
But you talk in particular, there's this radio incident. Is there a story to tell?
Absolutely. When I arrived at Berkeley, I thought I was going to be a little cog in the great deep machine of engineering, and I was going to do my little part in automating labor out of existence. Because that was the standard left-wing line. Afterwards, in January, or when I went back, March it was, back to Philadelphia, I had lunch with my uncle, who had spent his whole life in the clothing industry. And he sat me down at the Horn and Hard Arts Automat, and he said, you're an adventurer. Now, I nearly fell off the chair in my own thinking. What, me, an adventurer? No. But in fact, he was right. How I became an adventurer was, I was hanging around the headquarters of the free speech movement, waiting to be of use, waiting for somebody more intelligent than me to tell me what it is that I could do to help. The door flies open and a bunch of people run in and say, the campus is surrounded by police. Well, if you know the Berkeley campus, it's so huge you need a whole army to surround it, but never mind. Immediately the place galvanized, and I experienced this in a different way than it actually happened. The way it actually happened is the woman who had planted herself there as the house mother, whose father had been an engineer, said, can you make us a police radio? Because back in 1939, you could have done that, because police radio was in the same band as AM. And I knew that, but what I experienced was everybody looked at me, and in unison, they all shouted, quick, make us a police radio. And okay, I'm going through, I mean, 1939, but you couldn't do that now. It's 30 to 50 megahertz and it's narrowband FM. So I just start stammering, "You don't understand. It takes time." And then everyone in unison responded, "Never mind about that. Make us a police radio." Well, I couldn't do that. And at that instant, I realized my whole strategy was wrong. Waiting for somebody more intelligent than me to tell me what to do was a losing strategy because they didn't know what they were talking about. And it's like management wouldn't know what they're talking about either. And I realized, oh, I've got to arrange it so that I have things on the shelf that they don't know about. And when they say this, I can say, "Well, you can't have that, but here's something that's almost as good." And that will be reality for them. So I became that kind of adventurer.
Yeah. And ultimately, what kind of technology did you create for the free speech movement?
Not very much. I learned how to punch cards. Okay. You know, IBM's card punch 026, and sort things out. And I began at that point to develop lists of. By the time the free speech movement was over, by this point, but we had this successor.
Which is kind of ironic because one of the sort of manifesto points of the free speech movement was "Do not bend, fold, bend, fold, spindle, fold, mutilate." What?
I think I
anyway,
forget the order.
It was.
I am a human being.
Yes.
Bends, fold, spindle, or mutilate. Yeah. We made up cards like that. People other than me did that. So yes, the IBM punch card was the symbol of regimentation, digitization, and so forth. And there I was, learning how to use that technology, so we could put together volunteer lists and people who had resources that were willing to make them available next time. Right. So that's what I was working on.
And so then I'm very interested in your first tour of duty. Well, I think it's your first tour of duty in Silicon Valley. You ended up at Ampex as a junior engineer. Was that work study first, or was it actually a first job out of college? Or?
It was the first job out of college. I had suffered a depressive crash, which meant for the first time in my life I got all Fs, except one incomplete, and didn't care, and then could observe myself not caring, and I was horrified by that. This happens to a number of people. And I realized I can't stay here. So I withdrew from the university, quote, to restructure my motivations, and went to the want ads. And Ampex was advertising all over the place. And I thought I could be I knew I could be a technician. I mean, I realized that I had 5 years ahead of my fellow students in my knowledge of practical electronics. So I had 5 years to get fixed up and back into school and get my degree, because, to drop out of school was a terrible disgrace in my view. So Ampex was advertising for technicians. I went down there, and I had a little resume from my work-study experience. So I had signed on to the work-study program in engineering to make money so I could stay in school. And so I had three terms and wrote them up and went down there and handed it in. And the interviewer says, "Well, this doesn't look like a technician. This looks like a junior engineer. Would you be interested in taking a test?" Now, that is exactly what I had spent all my time in school learning how to do. Take tests. And I did very well in the test. And they sent me to a place, Special Products Division. Well, I wasn't very impressed by that. There was this big glass palace down there on Broadway. And I thought I'd like to be there playing with video and so forth. But no. Special Products was this dumpy little building, and what it was turned out to be the best place I could have signed up. They had to produce to order any oddball one-off product that people came in. Now, what I didn't know was the major customer was the government. It was the spook shop. And much later I found out they had actually developed the VCR, the VHS VCR there.
So this was surveillance technology, basically.
It was used for surveillance, intelligence gathering, and drones overflying the Soviet Union.
This is circa 67, 68 now?
I'm at 70, no, this is 67. The
Yeah.
end of 67, beginning of 68.
So what's so fascinating, so that's the year after Stuart Brand ended up in Menlo Park, 66, and he came because he had some sense that something was going on there. And Silicon Valley wouldn't be named until 71, but all the forces that would become Silicon Valley were alive and well. Did you have any sense of that there was something going on? You were in that sort of an analog world still at that point, weren't you?
Yes, I was, very much. And there was a lot going on in analog. I spent the first 2 years at Ampex doing analog design and learning how engineering was done. So it was a very busy place. There was a lot of manufacturing going on. It's like, so it didn't have a name, so what?
No. But this was, did you go back to school and get your degree?
I did after 4.5 years, yeah.
Oh, okay. So you were there for a while. And so you got, let me straighten things out in time. You got your degree about the same time you were starting Project One or Project?
It went right from one to the other, 1972. So I got my degree in the summer of 72. Okay. I had entered in the fall of 63, so 9 years to get a degree. But I must say, the education I got at Ampex was worth a great deal.
So what led you to start Project One?
Well, Project One was already there.
Okay. And was the computer already there?
No, the computer had been promised. No, Project One was a building that was inhabited in 1970 by a group started by some architects. And you know, anytime there's a big social problem, you're going to try to put your skills towards it. So they put their skills towards this. Let's form a community in a building. And so they were underway. They've been underway for a year, putting walls in the building and so forth. I heard about them kind of by accident, actually through my sort of network, and I talk about that in the book. And they had been finally given the commitment for the long-term loan of an SDS 940 computer. Now it turns out it is the very same computer that Doug Engelbart used for his mother of all demos, which demonstrated the personal use of computers for the first time ever.
Just out of curiosity, did you go to the mother of all demo?
I did not. I did not even know about it at the time. As I was able to tell Engelbart at one point, and you were there, I only heard about it third hand, and it changed my thinking.
Yeah, that's so. You know, I was a brief visitor to Project One. I was a couple blocks away at the San Francisco Study Center in '72 for a couple of months. Mm-hmm. I was in between college and graduate school, and somebody took me over to see this computer. So the computer must have been there by '72.
We installed it in 1972. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just there.
71 and 72 was still being done in the time when I was finishing up at Ampex.
Was Ephraim Lipkin already a friend of yours? He was one of the early people at...
He was someone I brought in, yes. I met him through Jude Milhon, whom I met through a relationship ad. Jude was an amazing person. And so I brought them really both in. But Ephraim was a systems programmer who was looking for something meaningful to do.
And the other person, I mean, there were a number of people, but Pam Hart was the person who actually shook the Transamerica company down for the computer.
She was the one who did the hustling. She deserves a great deal of credit. Yeah. And I talk about how that all happened in the book.
Well, so let's jump forward again, because another thematic, I mean, there's community and collaboration. The book also focuses on the idea of the democratization of information, which I think particularly is interesting in the light of the fact that you were borrowing a mainframe computer that had come from Stanford Research Institute, and ultimately you made your way to this notion of a community memory. And was the community memory brought up for the first time on that mainframe, or was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. In fact, we were failing in our original strategy of working with the switchboards in San Francisco. Now, the switchboards were just these little tiny information referral agencies, all of whom had a particular focus. And it was just a file card box and a phone, for the most part, was their technology. We were originally formed from the corporate remains of the San Francisco switchboard, which had gone to ground in Project One, and the founder had left it all with Pam Hart, so they restructured the 501c3, the nonprofit papers. So they were trying to be a resource, a computer resource for the counterculture. That was the idea. Yeah. And originally they were just using donated time, one-time sharing machines.
I remember when I first bumped into Community Memory that it seemed like the group had an ideology that computers should be shared community resources. In a sense, it was an anti-PC ideology. And could you unpack that?
Well, the concept of the PC came later.
Okay.
It was seriously affected, in my case, by my experience at Resource One. Ephraim went to a meeting with this reference librarians, county librarians. They're the ones who exchange books among libraries. And he explained this idea of, we have this, by that time we had an information retrieval system written, which was very flexible. It didn't require predetermined keywords, index words.
This is before or after Sequitur?
Well before.
Well before Sequitur, okay.
This, actually, Richard Greenblatt, the MIT hacker, eminence, showed up and said, let's write an information retrieval system in 24 hours. I remember seeing them, they're gesturing like this. And, the software folks
Was this done in assembler at that point? What did you have?
USPL, language you never heard of.
Okay.
Quick, simple programming language. Okay. It really only ran on 940s.
Okay.
So they put something together which was flexible. But you have the system, you don't have any data in it, which is pretty much what the librarians told Ephraim. They said, you seem to have a library with shelves but no books on the shelves. Well, why don't you put some books on the shelves and see who's interested in them? And he came back with that idea, and he said, why don't we put a terminal out in public and just see who uses it? And I thought, oh, this is risky, but what else are we going to do? Yeah. So we went ahead and did that. We put a terminal at the Leopold's Records in Berkeley. That was a record store that the student government had started to drive record prices down. I wound up giving a pitch to the student government, and they were fine with the idea. Great, go ahead and do it. And we had no idea who was going to use it. We set it up outside a musician's bulletin board. It was a teletype 33 inside a box that I built in order to muffle the sound. I had a modem there, and I had a phone line installed. And you would sit there next to it, and people would come down this hallway. And we would say, would you like to use our electronic bulletin board? We're using a computer. And they could see this thing sitting there, and it had two holes in it and a chair in front of it. And no one was in the chair. And they would say, oh, can I use it? Yeah, here, try it. And people started using it in ways in which we never anticipated. It was eye-opening. Yeah. All the musicians' traffic came over to the bulletin board, from what I could tell, superior technology. So we knew we had something going. And the way I put it in the book, which is the epigraph of the book, we opened the door to cyberspace and found that it was hospitable territory.
That's good. So this was slightly before you're writing about something called the Tom Swift Terminal. And Tom Swift Terminal was a significant moment because it led to a set of, things you did in hardware.
Right. Well, okay. we knew we needed better terminals. We were using old, failing teletype 33s that had been donated to us. And teletypes were far too noisy and so forth. We needed video display terminals, but they cost a good amount to rent. And we had an experience with their repair that left me very sour. That repair technicians didn't know what they were doing necessarily. At that time, an article had been published called The TV Typewriter.
Right, by Don
Lancaster.
Lancaster.
Don Lancaster.
Right.
And this allowed you to type on a keyboard, and it would connect to the antenna terminal of your TV, and you would put up the words on the screen. In TV production, it's called a character generator. Wow. And they did not print the construction plans, which were too involved, but they said, send in a self-addressed stamped envelope and $2. And the magazine thought they would get 20 responses. They got 10,000. 10,000. Something was going on here, and I knew that. And I looked at that, I researched that, I called up Lancaster. Turns out it wasn't suitable for terminal use, and I'll say why in the book, but I won't go into it now. But he had an idea that he said the next one I'm going to do is going to use random access memory, because at those times the memories they used were these recirculating shift registers, and you had to do all kinds of things and stand in your head to keep track of where the data was. So I took that point and started thinking about it. Okay, I knew there were microprocessors on the horizon. They cost $350 for an 8080 chip. Not practical, but you didn't need one for a terminal. So I worked out the details of how you could take a card with memory chips on it only, random access memory chips on it, and design circuitry to put the data in the right place in memory, to take it out in order, to put it up to the screen. I wrote this up in an engineering specification in 1974. And I mimeographed it and sold it for 25 cents, so it counts as publication, to the people I was hanging out with. There were these potluck dinners going on at the Community Computer Center in Menlo Park. I would take the train down, and
so you were in touch with, so this was, you were envisioning a window into a world of information at this point.
Right, literally a window on memory.
Yeah.
In a future computer.
Yeah.
And I had the structure there for how that was going to grow.
This was happening in parallel. Had you run it, well, Brand's Rolling Stone article had been published by that time, which you probably read, or
I was.
Oh, you were in it. You were in
it.
That's right. But okay, you were this coda at the end.
Yeah.
And Stuart was already slightly conservative and certain,
he was in love with the hackers down there.
You were political. He saw it.
And he said, the Resource One folk are well-meaning but stodgy.
Yeah. Yeah. So he also went to Park, and there was a little reference. I can't remember how much of the Dynabook idea came. Were you aware of the Dynabook ideas that early, or was that happening in parallel?
I was aware of the Dynabook ideas. We were talking about that at those potlucks. I had, in '73, I think, I got to take the backdoor tour of Park. They were just at that point being able to bounce a ball among.
So the Alto was just
coming up.
Wow.
Ethernet was just coming up.
So stuff was starting to leak out of the secret laboratories, basically, and you were part of this rebel mob that was going to take it and give it to the.
Well, yeah, we were going to develop some stuff that wasn't quite so fancy and expensive.
Yeah.
And do what we could.
So this is okay. This fits into some ideas that I have that I'm working on that I want to ask you about, that because your story is so much a part of this. I think that the conventional narrative about Silicon Valley is accurate but incomplete. There is this semiconductor-centric view of, depending on how far you want to go back, going back to Terman or Shockley, the Fairchild 8, all of that. I see that as the south end of the valley. I think there was this other thing going on directly around Stanford in the 60s that led directly to what you did. Now we jump farther to the Homebrew Computer Club, which grew out of this set of meetings you were having at the Community Computer Center, or the PCC.
The Community Computer Center. PCC was about publication.
That's right, the CCC. I think that all of the important ideas that drove computing came from this little world around Stanford. And it wasn't about conventional entrepreneurial notions that we talk about when we talk about, which is basically now get rich. How do you get rich? It was, in a sense, it was the antithesis of that. There were people like the people at Homebrew and the stuff that had come out of the free speech movement. There were people like Alan Kay or Doug Engelbart who were more about augmenting human knowledge. They weren't about starting companies. They weren't about, it was something else that was going on, but all the important ideas about what to do with this computing power were bubbling up here. When I wrote Dormouse, which was, what people took away from Dormouse is, you take some LSD and you become creative. That's never what I intended. What I noticed was that that the counterculture was technology adjacent. And I didn't have a complete understanding until after I'd published it. I stumbled across the people at the Santa Fe Institute, and they were complexity theorists, and they took some of those ideas, and particularly Stuart Kauffman, this biologist, came up with this idea that he tried to apply to the social sciences, which the argument was creativity emerges on the edge of chaos. And I looked at that and I said, that pretty much describes what was going on in the Mid-Peninsula. There were these 3 laboratories. They were on the edge of stuff. And people like you were a little closer to the edge, actually.
We were on the edge of the edge, yes.
So I think that completes the circle, is the way I'm going to, there's something special about the kind of entrepreneurship that grew up in Silicon Valley, which of course the best example of it is Apple, where you have a guy who just wants to build a computer to share with his friends, and another guy who happens to see there's a market. And it's that hacker sensibility with the entrepreneurial sensibility that comes together and changes the world. But you were doing the same thing.
Yes. I think it was 1984. I attended a conference. I heard a lecture by a guy named McLaughlin, who had run a school for entrepreneurs in Tarrytown, New York. And he lectured on what an entrepreneur is. And it turns out entrepreneurship is not about money. It's about an idea. It's about forwarding your idea and being involved in it as it's forwarded. At their school, they did an experiment. They took their students, they interviewed them, and they asked them, do you have a particular idea? They all did. That's why they were there. And they said, well, we represent a certain group of investors, and we're prepared. I guess they asked them, how much money do you think you could make? They offered them 3 times that if they would hand over their idea and walk away. That was the trick. None of them would. So what entrepreneurship is about is developing an idea and writing with it. Yeah. And in retrospect, I find out that I've been a very canonical entrepreneur. I didn't make money at it, but the book shows this.
So when Donald Trump was elected, there was this zeitgeist shift that affected the way the world saw Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley went from being perceived nationally and internationally as being all good overnight, really, to being seen as all bad. And 2 books came out in 2017. One was by Franklin Foer. It was called A World Without Mind. And the other was Jonathan Taplin's book, Move Fast and Break Things. And both of them were examples of this new critique of Silicon Valley. And the thing that shocked me was they both began with small biographies of Stuart Brand, who was the prince of hippies. What was he doing in this narrative about Silicon Valley? And Foer was just, I think, angry that a Facebook guy had ruined his magazine. But Taplin talked about the shift from they focused on Stuart because they considered him to be a technological utopian, and they associate that notion with Silicon Valley, which of course drives Stewart crazy because he thinks of himself as a pragmatist. But never mind. What was so interesting is that Taplin saw this break in Silicon Valley's view so the ideology of Silicon Valley from the utopians to, at the start of the dot-com era, the technology libertarians, the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musks, where it did become all about money, and there was this sort of shift.
Well, there was also, they brought in this libertarian ideology that we're going to change everything. The rest of you have nothing to say about that. We're so smart that we're going to impose upon the whole society this vision of that's basically feudalism. And rightfully, that got a lot of criticism.
Yeah, and it's still perturbing the world today. So I jumped away from the democratization of information, but I wanted to come back to that because there's this continual tug of war that seems to go on between centralization and decentralization, and you were on the decentralization end of things. Did that come, at one point you became very influenced by Illich.
Well, yes.
Ivan Illich was a...
Ivan Illich opened a door for me to how I could be effective. He had written a book called Tools for Conviviality. And in the book, he basically described how I had learned electronics by messing around with radios and so forth, not by submitting myself to a course of instruction. Now, actually, that statement isn't correct because my father arranged for me to receive a cast-off radio TV repair course. So I had those booklets, but again, I wasn't part of a system of instruction. And I learned it that way. And he said that basically this had gone on in Central America and so forth. He had studied it there, where radio appeared. And 2 years later, there was somebody locally who could fix the radio. Now, where did they come from? They were there all along. They were just the ones who you couldn't keep out of the radio. They were going to dink around with it. And fortunately, and this is important, the radio was designed to survive that kind of stuff. Vacuum tubes would not burn out in an instant like transistors would. And so I saw this and I realized, okay, if you can design it right, you can make the thing into a sort of a toy, make it accessible. And I came up with this concept that in order to make a piece of computer equipment survivable in public use, it had to be designed to grow a computer club around itself.
This is pre-homebrew then, this is going on?
Yes, that's 73. Yeah. And so in my writing of the specification for the Tom Swift terminal, that's what I had in mind. In fact, I included a little page paragraph describing the concept of conviviality.
Now you had to sort of pull Illich along, as I remember, that he didn't really understand computing, and you had to point out to him that computers could be convivial tools, right?
Actually, I guess it was in Tools for Conviviality, he has a little coda at the end in which he mentions that, no wait, I'm thinking of another book. I'm thinking of Deschooling Society, a rather bigger book. And at the end he has this little section in which he says, well, maybe computers can be used for setting up learning webs where people teach each other. You know, Illich was a medieval thinker. He was in love with the 13th century. And to him, that was a pinnacle of civilization. So I found myself confronting him at a house party after he had spoken at Berkeley. The host had already filled him in on who this crazy kid was. And Illich said to me, why do you do it, Lee? Why do you put computers between people? And why, if I wanted to talk to Pearl over there, I would just go and talk to her. I wouldn't go dee-dee-dee-dee-dee with the computer. I heard him out. And then I said, well, what if I didn't know that it was Pearl I wanted to talk to? He looked at me and said, "I see what you mean," which I appreciate. Illich, well, the thing he wrote up in Deschooling Society, he said, he mentioned 16-bit computers. And I said, click, he's been to MIT. He's talked with the gurus there. And they gave him some introduction because that's what would come out of that at that time.
But once again, this notion of, well, actually, there's another. At what point you came to the idea of something called an agora in technology too. Explain what how you were framing the idea of an agora.
Well,
in
it's pronounced agora.
Agora. I'm sorry.
I don't tell you that in the book, but I realized that now an agora is a human construction, artifact. Basically, it's what people do when they're together. And there's nothing preventing them from making whatever connections they want to. The walls to communication are down. And I talk about a thought experiment there, which actually I was able to try out last year when I went to China. The China Academy of Art had its 95th year celebration. They have an internet section. They invited me over. And because I'd shown them the manuscript of the book, they said, we specifically want you to do the experiment. It was a thought experiment. So we want you to try the thought experiment out. And we did that with 100 students in a room. I have yet to reduce the data. We have lots of cell phone video. I don't speak Chinese. Someone will have to listen to that, etc. But the point of it is, if you found yourself in a space with a lot of people whom you didn't know, what would happen? And it would turn out some people would start to perform. They would start to talk for everybody to hear. And some people would listen. And some people would lurk. And some people would engage in back and forth with the people who were performing. I lay this out in the book a bit. And that, to me, is my best imagination of what goes on in an agora. Yeah. Now, the other way to look at it is civilization developed in the village, but not in the houses of the village. It developed in the space between the houses, where people who are not in the same familial group would interact. And it became the place where personal, political, and economic transactions were conducted in public. And as you see, for a pre-literate society, that's all important, because that's your database. People will say, yeah, he did say that, and they will agree with each other and so forth. That's how, people were held to their commitments. So it's a very, very old element that I think is built into us, built in by our cultural evolution. And I don't know enough about how that happened. But that's what I'm trying to do, is to empower the agora with the latest technology. Because, as I say, the agora is a social construction that people bear with them. Yeah. They will set one up if they don't have any way.
Well, how does that square with this other dichotomy that I think you bring out in the book, which struck a note with me? You talk about the idea of an information feedlot, I think, in the book, which I thought was, given where we are today, a particularly apt description of the evolution of networks. Can you contrast it with the idea of a public park?
Right.
And I mean, are you still? We're definitely. To me, it seems like you're right. We're way over on the feedlot side of the equation. Is there a path that you can see back to a public park?
Well, I think you may have read that in a version that I gave you before I finished the book. And that's what the last third or quarter of the book is about. How you get from here to there. The information feedlot is there because the money is there. It makes money. And I talk about how when you get at the history of all this has been when somebody develops some software, like Craigslist, and it works, and people use it, and you make money. You don't develop it any further. But if you go ahead and continue to develop stuff, you have freedom that you don't have if you're just building a feedlot. And so what I came up with was that we need a kind of an information function, utility, agora function, actually, empowered by the best technology we can organize, and supported the same way that public parks are supported. Park and rec. Right. And librarians, I think, will be very significant people in all of that. They'll be the custodians of the commons of information, which is the other word for the agora. And I'm an optimist. I think if we can imagine it, we can build it. We can get there.
I have hints that I see it bubbling on the edges. I don't know if you followed in the capture of Twitter by Musk. One of the things that's been set off is a movement by people away from Twitter and the movement to build alternatives to Twitter. And they seem to have coalesced around the use of this protocol called ActivityPub. Mastodon is built on top of ActivityPub. Oh. Facebook has created threads on top of ActivityPub. ActivityPub, I see this community emerging around it, which is kind of a democratization of media movement. And it's very early stages, but it seems like it has some legs, and it speaks exactly to what the things you're talking about at a high level. But it's an implementation strategy. The people who are doing it are just like the people around homebrew in the 70s. They have a mission. They've seen something that people haven't seen, and so I mean they're.
Well, I've never heard of ActivityPub till now.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to hear about it. I think I'm signed up on Mastodon, but I've never used it.
Yeah. Well, so I was driven away from Twitter, and so I've been playing in these little.
Well, somebody has to do it.
Yeah. Your career touched a whole series of important sort of inflection points in Silicon Valley. There was homebrew, of course, and personal computing came out of that. But then, other places that I'm curious about, you spent a half decade at Interval Research. And Interval was an effort to redo the impact of Park. And ultimately, at least on the face of it, it didn't have that kind of impact. What do you take away from your Interval experience?
Well, I need to be a little careful here because I've signed an agreement for my severance.
Okay, which isn't
all that expensive, but it's more than I have.
Surely that's not still. There's no financial stuff at this point, is there?
Well, it's money that's been spent. They
Yes.
could sue me for it. I would not be part of any story about Interval.
Yeah.
And they sent somebody around to try to act like they were
Enforce
writing a
that
story.
Yeah.
So I still don't know if I'm legally safe there, but I'm not going to tell stories about Interval, I'm afraid. There's some interesting stories. I would say, sort of, without providing any details, I know they ran into a problem because the thinking there at the beginning was that the important people are the ones who own the content, the movie studios and so forth. And there was this big discussion at the time that I was drawn into outside of Interval about we own the content, so we roll the world, or versus it's pipes and meters, get with it. I was brought in to specifically proselytize the pipes and meters version. This is to a meeting of CEOs and so forth. It was annual. And I tried to tell them that we had found experimentally that people would create their own content. And the content they thought they had wasn't all that valuable. But at Interval, it seemed to be accepted. I tried to bring in community memory to Interval. How could I have been prevented? Well, it turns out I was prevented. And I was told there is no place for that here.
That's interesting.
And in fact, someone very influential got up in our online communities meeting that one of our projects organized, which involved Engelbart. And he said, the internet will never amount to anything. Well, that person did not survive past a couple of years. So Interval did some wonderful work in ethnology. That's it.
Yeah.
Basically learning how people live, and a lot of stuff with art and so forth. I was running a project which was building prototypes for people, and I did some interesting stuff there. I didn't, however, change the world in any particular way. So after that person was gotten rid of, it didn't get any better, I'll put it that way.
I learned, I think from reading one of the drafts about a startup activity I didn't know about called Upstart that you were involved in.
Oh, yeah.
And I hadn't heard about Upstart until, I guess it's because it didn't surface into the world, is why I didn't hear about it.
Yeah, it never made it out. Well, in around 1986, after Osborne had its flame out, I was thinking what to do. And I came up with this idea that you could basically apply the trick that I learned back in 1975 about putting a window in memory. You make it a very dense memory, and you can take a 300 dot per inch full page image, which of course the Alto was doing. But I knew that you could in fact feed this out through hardware to a laser engine. And that's the part of the laser printer that doesn't have any intelligence. It just prints every line that it's given. And you could have guaranteed, I called it physical WYSIWYG or FYSIWYG. Put it on a circuit board that would fit in an ISA slot in a PC. And at that time, the 386 was just arriving. And I had a space on it for a 386. And the software would somehow, materialize. It didn't materialize, but Digital Research had the GEM system. Yeah. And while I couldn't deal with Microsoft, I could deal with them. They were easy to deal with. And we had GEM running on the main processor of the CPU that was of the PC was plugged into. So this was just a display and printer board. It was pretty messy and complex, I must say, like a solid block. And we got it to print pages, but there was so much else that was needed. The investors we found were through this theatrical producer who felt that his approach was, if I have a problem, I think of a story I can tell. You need more than a story. Yeah. So I brought in investors. I had to pay off $30,000 afterwards and so forth. I call it Tales of Silicon Valley Glory, satirically.
Well, it's a very standard, that is the standard Silicon Valley story. The others are all the exceptions.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that comes across in the book is your view of engineering as being a social good. And I think that's sort of
well, yeah,
an interesting and not always typical view of it.
Yes, I mean that grandfather of mine wrote an article, and he talks about. I opened the article by saying man, commerce, and engineering. So that's how the sequence of things happened in the grand sweep of history. And I say, no, that's not right. People dream. People have creators exist. I don't know where they come from. I'm one, but I don't know where it comes from. It's not because somebody gave me any money. Nobody gave me money. But we're there, and we can make new things. And then there's, commerce taking place, and they notice that there's these people that can improve it. And so they pay the people who become the engineers, and they produce the stuff they need. Fine. That's where it gets started. But by now, I believe we're actually in a golden age of engineering. It's already started with open source and crowdfunding, because you can put out an idea, you can get money from individuals, just given freely. There's no, you can't get sued. And you can go ahead, and if you can get it to work, you got a product or something close to a product. And your people who've signed up for it and given the money, they're your customers to start with. And also, people cooperate with each other. That's a natural phenomenon. I saw that happening even against corporate policies. Back when I was putting the computer up, we needed a special light bulb for the paper tape reader. And Xerox had them. And I remember talking with going down to get one from, somebody had talked to somebody at Xerox, and they said, well, I'm not supposed to do this, but I'll give you the light. I give you the lamp. Because there was some internal politics at Xerox meant that this guy basically said, don't cooperate with them. But the whole industry operates on cooperation, and it's under the table if it's not on top.
Yeah.
And I got the light bulb.
So that's, on a theoretical level, that really, if you read the literature about the formation of Silicon Valley, Anna Lee Saxenian, who wrote this book called Regional Advantage, falls into this cooperation or informal networks that emerge. And I can't tell you that, I was just talking to he's actually a relative of mine. He was early, he didn't work at Fairchild, he worked at Raytheon next door to Fairchild in the 60s, but he was one of those people who hung out every night at the Wagon Wheel, which was this early bar where the entire semiconductor industry met.
That's a third place. It's something I talk about.
Yeah. You talk about Wagon Wheel in your...
Not the Wagon Wheel specifically.
Yeah.
But yes, the fact that Silicon Valley existed because of the third places.
Yeah.
The one concept is that there's this big Mount Olympus in the center, and all the important people are on top. And surely you must have known name. No, I was literally down at the bottom of the mountain.
Yeah.
And so what Silicon Valley was a series of little molehills, each centered around one company, and between them were the bar and grills, where people would go out for lunch, and where when you got fired and you started your own or were trying to start your own business, you could go back there. Nobody would prevent you. And you could recruit among your fellows. You know who they were.
There was a period where people felt that they worked for Silicon Valley, not for the particular company they worked for.
It's an interesting way of putting it.
And if you wanted to change jobs, you just drove in a different driveway. That was, I don't know if we're still in that era or not. Every time, though, people seem to think that the Valley is dead, it has this way of fooling people and reemerging.
Well, it's a state of mind in a general physical area, is the way I put it.
Yeah, that's good. Language models, this current wave in Silicon Valley, have you followed it and have any sense of where it fits into your worldview?
Well, the section in the book is titled Artificial Stupidity. Well, that tells you how I think of it. It reminds me of the classmate in high school who was always looking at other people's papers to find out find the answer. He never had confidence in being able to come up with an answer himself. Yeah. I did not have a very high opinion of him. Yeah. And if that's not creativity, see.
Well, there's certainly been a wave of investment. This is currently, it's the post-social media era. Well, I guess in between social media and language model, there was cryptocurrency, and cryptocurrency seems to have had its moment as well. But the Valley continues to surprise people, and things tend to come out of left field. Certainly language models came out of left field. Even the guys at Google who invented them were surprised that they emerged. So it's an interesting aspect.
Yeah, nothing I do is going to change that torrent of money that's sloshing back and forth. And what happens out of that. But I'm certainly not going to make anything I do dependent upon that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see where. So you talk about the counterculture. Did you actually define yourself at a certain point as being of the counterculture?
I wouldn't say so.
I would sort of put. That's an interesting question, because when I think about Project One and community memory, I think of those as counterculture institutions, and you were one of the creators, so you probably, and actually Homebrew too, firmly countercultural.
That's an interesting example, because it was really so many cultures put together. When I was in the hairiest part of the underground press, the breakaway paper, somebody said, "How do you do it, Lee? How do you move between two worlds?" And I said, "Don't you know there's only one world?" So it's sort of all how you look at it. No, I was an engineer, a technologist, who was not preventing myself from dealing with counterculture people and so forth. There's a photo of me from the Berkeley Barb in 1968. Every Wednesday I would come up dressed up in a tie and suit from work at Ampex and do my writing. So we had Jerry Rubin come in, and he's in his wildest get up at that point. He went through several such phases.
Stockbroker at one point.
Even that. And I'm interviewing him. And so there's the two of us. I'm sitting here very, very neat with my hair all in place. His is all out of place. And I want to get that photo around. I didn't, of course, publish it here. Yeah, but it's like, it's one world. Yeah. You know, these divisions like counterculture, hippie, whatever, are all artificial. Yeah.
So, what was your goal in writing this book? What set of ideas did you want to get across?
Well, people had started asking me, "That stuff you do with social media, aren't you sorry?" Well, that needed an answer. Yeah. And the answer is in here. Okay. Several times I say I'm not. But also, all through my, call it a career, people have come up to me and said, "I can't understand why you're doing what you're doing." And that did need an answer, because that's my ancient mariner question. It's like I have to tell everybody for 90 minutes where it all came from and so forth, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So why not put it down in a book, and I can say, just buy the book, I'll get some money.
The social media question is an interesting one, because you were an early participant, not just in terms of creating community memory, but also in the Well that Stuart Brand created. And the Well is sort of seen as this early example. What's interesting that's not well known is that Stuart, who was the designer of the Well, thought that it was a failure. And he thought it particularly because even though he made anonymity impossible on the Well, it was designed not to permit anonymous communication, they did permit pseudonymous communication. And he felt that that was a mistake in the end, that people behaved in ways that we see now on social media all the time. Mm-hmm. They behaved in ways they wouldn't have behaved if you were in a face-to-face encounter with someone. And that was an interesting. Ultimately, he was driven away from the Well at a certain juncture, and sort of never loved it again, as he told the New Yorker. Oh. But social media has gone on to haunt the entire world.
Well, yes, I'm not saying it's not a problem. It's a problem, and the book talks about why it's a problem structurally, and what we can do about it. And I'm working on it. I mean, the next thing I do, after I got through with this publicity on the book, is to specify at least the user interface for Community Memory version 4. Because that's been hanging around with me for quite some time. We're pretty much have been stuck in the age of papyrus scrolls. Look at Craigslist, that's what it is. Yeah. And so we can go better than that. We can use pages, which work in several dimensions.
It's interesting. You're now in Ted Nelson territory in a kind of interesting way.
It's I'm very honored to be in such territory. And certainly Ted's going to get one of these books.
Yeah.
It all seems so simple, right? It always does. And and when we get there, you can spend your whole life talking about how it should be, but you got to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to do it. And then they say, oh, yes, well, that's, of course, how you do it.
It's interesting that you're focusing on interface. I've left the New York Times, but I went a couple of months ago to hear what are called the masthead editors talk about we used to call it the front page. Now they call it the home page.
Oh.
And what it turns out is that most people today, if you took by sheer numbers, consume the New York Times in the palm of their hand on a smartphone.
As do I.
So, it turns out when you have a window that's that small, you're pretty much reduced to scrolling. You can scroll this way and you can scroll that, but the kind of structure of information that you saw in a newspaper is very hard to replicate in that small environment. And in fact, what I discovered is that they don't really care, that they're focused on this as the distribution device, which was actually made me kind of sad.
When you think about it, the newspaper is a papyrus scroll anyway. It's just several of them.
Yeah, it's true. But there was some structure. There was meta information in the organization information on that scroll. So it wasn't just, I consider what you're talking about as being the wire service, this blast of information that's infinite. And I've always thought that getting away from that was essential. But we don't seem to. TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, they're all scrolls.
One of the brilliant and yet sadly flawed people in Silicon Valley, Blair Newman, he laid out the idea that it was the Osborne computer, and he tried to shop it around, and Steve Jobs threw it out the window. At one point, he called together a meeting of people he knew. He had this idea that now is possible with enough electronics on you to have the entire internet pouring through your brain, which may be of interest to people dealing with mental illness. But that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to walk through the world and have the whole internet roaring through his head. Well, I'm not interested in that.
It's like being jacked into the Matrix, I think,
exactly.
Or something like that.
They didn't have that word then.
Tell me a little bit more about Blair Newman.
Blair Newman. Oh, well, he was he had one of these brilliant what's the psychological term? But schizophrenics, probably. He had worked for Hughes in the Hughes bunker in Las Vegas, God knows doing what. And he could spew off these ideas that other people could build. But he'd never get, they don't keep him around or give him any responsibility because that's something he can't handle. So he spewed off the idea of the 5.5-inch floppy, 5.25-inch not floppy, hard disk.
Hard disk?
Yeah, and which Seagate made happen. So people like that, always on the periphery, and always dissatisfied by that. So he actually committed suicide in 1985, and he did it online before he did it physically.
Oh, right.
He scribbled, erased all of his postings on the well.
That's right. I remember.
So in effect, he invented online suicide.
Yeah. How are you going to publicize your book?
I'm going to publicize it on podcasts, and this sort of counts as one. Think of a book talk.
Yeah.
If you can get 20 people there, you're really lucky.
That's the wisdom of Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly thought that podcasts were the...
And I think you told me that.
Yeah.
I'm taking him up on that.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know. I mean, I'll do some appearances, but that's more for my own ego than for the book sales.
Well, this is good. Thank you for the introduction to Me and My Big Ideas by Lee Felsenstein.
Yeah, there's a picture on the back of the book.
A picture on the back.
There's some people in a room with phones and their backs are all to the camera. That was shot in 1964 by me at the headquarters of the free speech movement. That's the phone room. And you notice a lot of papers on the wall. That was the first example of a switchboard in the countercultural sense. Yeah. And I consider it to be the origin point for the social internet. It was through me, yes.
Yeah. Did you put it together, the phone room? Did you put the phone room?
No, I didn't do that.
That was just, I see.
And
But you were there participating.
I was there
Yeah.
trying to participate.
Yeah.